Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. I'm so thankful you've stopped by today. Today I'm going to show you how I created a beach resin charcuterie board. So I have this board. I actually just ordered it off of Amazon. And first thing I'm going to do is tape off the back areas. When you're pouring resin, you get drips down the side and on the bottom. And I'm taping it off to protect it so that I can more easily remove the excess that accumulates on the bottom throughout the whole process here. Now you can see that I'm using just little bits of painter's tape. I will end up getting a little tiny bit of seepage underneath the tape, but I use a scraper to get it off, and then I also sand it down with some really fine grit sandpaper at the end just to smooth it all out and have it looking nice. So I'm going to continue to put this tape on any of the areas that I think are going to get drips on them. And you obviously, as you can see, you don't need to use one whole piece. You just want to make sure that you have it protected as best as you can. And this particular board rounds around the edges, so it doesn't have straight edges to it. So that's why where you're seeing the tape is just a little bit in from the wood. It's because it's rounded and it's where the flat part of the back is. By doing separate pieces of the tape here, it's going to end up being a little bit easier to take it off section by section at the very end. But you definitely want to do this step ahead of time to make the end job easier. Often when I'm doing beach resin on wood panels, I will use some finishing wax before time. I didn't want to do that here because this is meant for food, and even though it's the back of the board, I just didn't really want to put something on there that wasn't really meant for food. Even though resin itself, you're not supposed to put your food right on the actual resin part. That's why the decoration is right on the top part and not over the whole board. Now you can see I'm putting some strips of thick painter's tape over the board. This is just to protect it, just at the off chance that I get a little bit of drip here and there. I don't have to worry about having to remove that from the board. Best to just take the time to protect it right from the beginning. And I ended up having it up a little bit too much, so I will end up taking some of that top part off. So the resin I'm using is Moss Epoxy's Tabletop. There are two parts to it, and to use it, you mix even parts of each one. I have some silicone measuring cups, and they have measurements to the side of them. So again, equal parts of each one. Mix it really, really well for 3 minutes. Follow all the safety instructions for the resin that you are using. That's usually on the bottle or on their website. In those little cups, I have 4 cups there. I'm going to keep one that has a little bit of clear. I'm going to color one white for the white of the waves. And I'm using a mix-all white for this particular project. And then I have some blue acrylic paint. I'm going to make a darker blue. And then I'm going to have a 4th container, and I'm going to use some of that blue and some white just to make a lighter color. So I have 2 shades of blue. You don't really notice the 2 shades of blue in the project, but I like having a darker hue and a lighter hue of the same color. Once they are all mixed, again, make sure that you have your safety things on. I have some disposable gloves on. The ones that I use make it nice and easy that I can actually feel things. But my hands are protected. You never want to touch resin with your bare hands. You always want to use protection. You want to make sure that it is mixed really, really well. The white for the waves, when you mix it, if you can't see your stick through it, you're good, your stir stick. If you can still see a little bit of the stir stick, you want to add a little bit more colorant. When you're adding colorant to your resin, you don't want to add more than 10% of the amount of resin. And I typically eyeball it. I've never had an issue with it, but you just don't want to add too much colorant. And when I say that, I mean by paints and liquid amounts, because it's going to affect the finish. It's not going to finish curing properly if you add too much liquid. If you're using mica powders, that's not going to affect the liquid at all. So I'm going to start with my darkest color. You'll notice I have a little green plug at the top. This particular charcuterie board has a rivet at the top, and I wanted to protect that. So I just have some clay with some painter's tape around it that I am using to protect that plug. I have it in for every single layer of resin that I'm using on this particular tray. What I tend to do is after about a half an hour or 45 minutes of it curing, I'll remove that plug. By that time, the resin is nice and sticky. And then I will take a Q-tip and some isopropyl alcohol and clean that rivet off. And I do that with every single layer just to make sure it has a really nice finish. So now that I've mixed the two, the darker and the lighter blue, I'm going to do a line of clear resin and then a line of my white. That clear resin really helps the white to float on top of the colored. So I'm taking my heat gun with the regular end that it has. I'm not putting anything on it right now. And I'm just using that to remove the bubbles. You want to do that before you start blowing out the waves. This is also going to heat the resin up a little bit and make it a little bit more fluid, and it will end up blowing out a little bit easier. So I've put a finer tip on my heat tool. I'm holding it up as horizontal as possible, and I'm blowing that white over top of the blue. And you'll see I go back and forth a little bit with it. And then I noticed that my resin was getting a little bit close to the tape, so I just pulled it up so that it didn't run along that edge of the tape there. I wanted to add little stripes of white in the darker blue area because I want to give that some color variation and depth as we go along. I make sure to run my fingers along the outside and the bottom to make sure that it's evenly over the sides. So that's where I'm talking about the rivet there. I do have some painter's tape protecting it so that it makes it easier to clean. This here is my second layer of resin. My first layer has already cured. Once again, I have a light blue, a darker blue, and then my clear and my white. I didn't show the mixing process for this one because it's exactly the same as the first layer. So there's no difference between that. So I'm going to take my finger and mix between the dark and the light blue a little bit. And once again, you can see I have gloves on. Don't do this with a bare finger or bare hand. Making sure that it's running over the sides evenly. Now a little strip of my clear and then a little strip of my white. So this resin, or this board, I actually ended up doing 5 layers of resin. I originally was going to do 3, but as I was going, you just kind of get a feel for what it needs. I just felt that it needed a little bit more than 3. I wanted at least 1 up the handle, so I ended up adding 5 layers. Odd numbers, I like odd numbers. So that first run over with my heat gun was just to remove the bubbles. Now I've got the narrower tip on there. I'm using a higher speed and I'm just blowing that white over top of the blue to create the waves. And then just a little bit of the white kind of stripes. They don't actually end up curing white. They get mixed in with the blues, and through the layers, it just adds a little bit more depth and a little bit more interest to the handle. This is now my 3rd layer. For this one, I only did the darker blue, the clear, and, oh no, actually I did do the lighter one on this one. So darker blue, then the lighter blue, mix them together, make sure that everything is good and covered. Including all of those sides. Now I use silicone cups for this, which makes it really, really easy to clean them out between each and every layer. I use duct tape with the sticky side out around my fingers and just use the sticky part of the duct tape to help clean them. Now I've got my clear stripe down, and then I am doing just a thin layer of white. And then I'll take my heat gun and blow that out. First removing the bubbles. So as the resin cures, I spend the first probably half an hour or so just watching it, making sure no dust or anything has fallen into the resin, making sure no bubbles accumulate. If there's any bubbles, I'll just blow them out. If there happens to be a bit of dust, I'll just take a toothpick and scoop it out. If that happens to be in an area where I'm already going to put some more resin, it's not nearly as important as the areas that aren't going to be recovered. So this here is my 4th layer. I went just the handle and just a tiny little bit into the board. This time I only had the blue and then the clear and the white. I did not do a light blue. And as you saw, I just went and took my finger and mixed it all together, making sure everything was covered really well. Little line of the clear and then a little line of the white. And I'll often, when I'm doing this, have a second project on the side, because when I mix the resin, I tend to mix a little bit too much. Better to have too much than not enough. And this particular shape wasn't one that I could use the resin calculator on Moss Epoxy's website to calculate how much was needed. So I do have a project on the side. My next video is going to be what those are. But always good to have a project on the side or some molds, obviously smaller than what you're working on, just to use up that resin. There's no point in it going to waste. So my fourth layer here is completely cured. This is the last layer, and I'm not going to go fully down the handle. I just have the dark blue and then the clear and then the white. And I'm just doing it, I want to say about halfway, 2/3 of the handle. Just to give that a little bit of interest, break it up a little bit. Typically when I do beach resin pieces, I usually do 3 layers. This one I just kind of felt it needed a little bit more. So I've just made sure that everything was completely covered. Then I'm going to do a thin layer of my clear and then a thin layer of white. And then use the heat gun to remove any air bubbles. Put that narrower tip onto the heat tool and then blow that white out over top of it. Now when you first do those waves, sometimes they don't really look, they don't kind of create the cells and whatnot. That happens as it sits, so don't worry if it didn't go exactly as planned. Sometimes as it sits, you'll find they start to develop a little bit more. A little bit of those stripes on there. So all 5 layers there are completely cleared. I have a shower curtain that I protect my work surface with, and the resin, once it's all cured and I'm cleaning up, it just peels right up off of it. Same with the painter's triangles that I use to hold my piece on so it's above my surface. I'm just going to remove some of that tape, and that tape did a really good job of protecting the surface because I ended up having a few drips on it. So to remove the tape and the resin drips from the back, I'm just using my heat tool with the narrower tip on them, working about 1 inch or 2 at a time, just heating up that resin a little bit. It doesn't need to be piping hot, but you do want it to be a little bit hotter, a little bit softer. And then as you pull up the tape, it just pulls up those drips. Now I still go back in after this and use a retractable razor scraper to help remove some of the excess and to get it really nice and smooth. But this removes a lot of them. You'll see here that I do have a little bit of seepage from under my tape. If on projects I put some finishing wax there, that doesn't happen because it protects the wood. I just didn't want to put it on this just because it was meant for food. I didn't want to put some finishing wax on there. So to use that scraper, I just take my heat gun and warm up that resin a little bit again. Once again, just a little bit. It doesn't need to be piping hot. And then I'm gently using my razor scraper. It's very sharp. I don't want to gouge the wood, so I'm just being very, very gentle to remove that resin but not gouge the wood at all. Once I've got a lot of that removed with the razor scraper, I'm going to take some sanding paper, and I have some 320 grit and some 400 grit sandpaper that I used on it to remove some of the excess resin that the scraper wasn't taking off. It came off fairly easily. The main thing is to be very patient and just take it a little bit at a time. We don't want to rush this. Like I said, we don't want to gouge the board. You want to be as gentle as possible. And one thing I realized I forgot to mention, I put this board on a towel to do this work. I don't want to put it on into anything hard. While the resin is cured to the touch, it does continue to cure for a while. So I don't want to possibly scratch the surface. So I always put it onto a soft towel or something that is soft just to protect it. So there is the finished product. I hope you enjoyed the process. Have a great day. Thank you so much for being here.